This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with writer, novelist and former barrister Jock Serong. As long as he can remember, Jock wanted to be a writer, but after doing better than expected in Year 12, it was decided a law degree was a much safer bet than studying journalism. Despite doing some truly fascinating cases, including early native title work in Western Australia and junioring in the Silk Miller murder trials, it was always the stories and not the law that captivated Jock. So after almost 2 decades in the law, he let his practising certificate expire and made the leap to full-time writer. Jock has written 7 novels, including Quota, which won the Ned Kelly Award for Best First Novel, and his most recent work, Cherrywood, whose protagonist, Martha, is a lawyer in a large Melbourne firm. As we will hear today, although the law was never his passion, Jock still loved his first career, and it has provided both insight and inspiration for his writing.
Although you can't use the individual stories you've been exposed to in legal practice, what you can use is the way people are under that sort of pressure, that you're watching people process the worst experience of their lives. And that means you're watching their eyes, you're watching their hands, you're watching the way they position their body, you're listening to the way their voice works, and all of those things somehow feed their way into character when you come to write fiction.
Good morning to Lives in the Law. Our guest this morning is someone who practised for 18 years as both a barrister and a solicitor, but for the last 12 years has been a full-time author, writer. He's published 7 books, starting with Quota in 2014, followed by The Rules of Backyard Cricket, On the Java Ridge, Preservation, The Burning Island, The Settlement, and his last novel, recently published, Cherrywood. Good morning to Jock Serong.
Morning, Michael.
And Jock, it's great to have you all the way from Port Fairy with us here this morning. Jock, we'll dive straight into the legal part of your life, I guess, because it wasn't really your first choice to be a lawyer, was it?
No, it wasn't at all. And in fact, I mean, there were lawyers further out in the family, but nobody within immediate reach to talk to about that as a career. And I was one of those kids at school who was completely fixated with books and reading, and all I ever wanted to do was write. I remember those periods at school where you had to write some imaginative piece and just thinking, I can't believe this is schoolwork. This is the only bit I like. So I think I had that very much in mind all the way through school, and I enrolled in journalism when I finished Year 12, but somehow took a left turn and wound up in a law degree.
Tell us about that left turn.
Well, in Year 11, I got crook and missed most of the year. I had glandular, and it meant that I had to work really hard in Year 12. And so perhaps the result at the end surprised me a bit and surprised the family. So the decision was, you can still be a writer if you want, but let's do it with a law degree rather than doing it either straight off the bat or with a journalism degree. So that was the theory. It was this sort of protective instinct. I think things were economically a little bit rough at the time. This was heading towards the recession. And so I went off and did the law degree. And I can still remember being on the train, having gone into Melbourne Uni and picked up all the folders of, as they were in those days, folders of subject material, and thinking, okay, the stories are pretty good. Maybe this is just a story thing and I can do it.
Second year of your law degree, you took a gap year?
Yes, yeah.
That wasn't usual. I think it was usual now even.
No, well, it might, Michael, it might reflect the fact that I was a little ambivalent about the life. And so I went off with a girlfriend in a car and we drove around Australia, and it maybe had that salutary effect where you see how hard life could be as a wage earner without a qualification, drifting between jobs, which is essentially what we did for a year. It was a fantastic year, and it was probably my first exposure to Aboriginal Australia and one of a handful of things that started to turn me towards thinking much harder about that.
despite the fact you weren't that keen on your law degree, and I understand that, you must have got good marks because you got your articles at a good-sized commercial firm, Dunhill, Madden Butler.
I think what happened was as I went along, I started to get the hang of it. I remember distinctly that the back half of my degree was much stronger than the front half. And the front half, in those days at least, was all of those really technical, difficult compulsory subjects like property law. I reckon I might have just squeaked into the 50s in property law. But as things went along, I found ways to make it more interesting for myself. And I was doing art subjects alongside it and doing Russian literature, which I was loving. So that helped to open things up a bit and make the study more enjoyable.
Was there any crossover between the art subjects, Russian literature in particular, and law subjects? Did you see any connection between the two, or they were just parallel lines, never joining?
I think they were parallel lines. The other thing I was doing was archaeology, and I had hoped after that year of driving around Australia, I had hoped that archaeology meant thinking about Aboriginal civilizations going way, way back. And we studied Mesopotamia, we studied the Peloponnesians. It was all the Near East and Europe, and unfortunately it really didn't touch on Australia at all. But I remember those art subjects as being this kind of breath of fresh air among the stodgier part of the law degree. But the law degree, as I say, was getting more interesting by then.
And in the law degree, the stories that you picked up on, were they mainly in crime or were they in other subjects as well?
Yeah, particularly crime. I remember thinking that I was easily distracted by stories in crime. And in fact, that was still the case when I was practising crime, that where other people had this innate ability to go straight to the technical matrix of the problem and to think about the rules that applied, I was still fascinated that someone got themselves into this situation. And that was the bit, if I was interviewing clients much later in my career, in a blank room, about to go into a courtroom and seeing what was etched on their faces and hearing the tone of their voice and thinking about what they'd been through, whether prosecution side or defence side, that to me was always the compelling thing above and beyond what I should have been paying attention to, which was how on earth we were going to get out of this pickle.
Did your articles at Dunhill, Madden Butler engage you? Did you learn things there which were applicable throughout the rest of your time in the law?
Yeah, I did. And I was really lucky in that it was a commercial law firm in the CBD, and that may have been a really anodyne experience, but as it was full of all these just fantastic personalities. I worked with Pat McCabe, who was something of a legendary insurance lawyer, and he was a great teacher and a charismatic presence, and he made it look like it could be fun. And there were lots of other people in that firm at the time who were like that. So it was a much better year, I think, than I expected it to be.
But still, at the end of it, you wind up in Warrnambool.
Yes.
Which is a long way from the CBD.
Yes.
And getting a tram to work every day.
Yeah.
How did you wind up in Warrnambool?
Well, there were a few things going on. Mum and Dad were breaking up at the time, and I'm in my mid-20s by this stage. That, on one analysis, maybe that shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it was a difficult time. And I felt like I could see that the long-range prospects at Dunhill's probably weren't for me, although I'd had a good year. And I came to this idea that if I could find a law firm on the coast somewhere, I could go surfing and I could still practice law, and I could just take a year or two and put the brakes on and think about where I was going. It's that patch that I think a lot of people hit in their mid-20s where you're just not sure. You can feel the long term starting to loom, but you're not sure who you are yet. So I got a map out and I poked a finger at Port Fairy and put everything I owned in the car, and I drove there, and that was that.
As a kid who grew up in Melbourne, where there are no surf beaches, how did you become such a keen surfer as you are to this day?
A couple of things. There is a break in Port Phillip Bay when the wind blows hard enough from the southwest for long enough at Greens Point, Brighton Beach. So I used to surf there as a kid, and I could almost see it from home, but I'd ride the push bike down there and surf in the bay, which actually resulted in my worst surfing injury, but that's another whole story. And our dad was great. He would drive us down the coast a lot because we were skateboarding for years. I'm one of four brothers, and at least three of us were skateboarding, and I think particularly back then that naturally evolved into surfing, and the surfing came to take over after time.
And surfing was so important to you that you wanted to live and work near a surf beach.
Yes, and I think I knew that that was a way of settling, that I could spend time, if necessary, by myself, and it was then and it is now thinking time. And it was a way of, bringing nature back into my life, bringing the coast back into my life after that long stint in the city.
Jock, you're enjoying the life in Port Fairy, surfing, legal work. I'm assuming you're working in Port Fairy, a general practice, looking after all of the needs of people who live down there, be it their conveyancing, be it their probate, be it some litigation, magistrates' court, whatever.
Well, the firm did that for sure. It was a general practice country firm, but my particular job as the junior was to do the advocacy. So I'd do all of the guilty pleas in the Magis Court during the week, and that evolved into running a few contests. And the purpose of that, I don't know that it was remunerative for the firm. I think it was about just keeping the firm in the local paper. So yes, did that work for about 18 months.
And yet after 18 months and enjoying the work, as I understand it, enjoying the lifestyle in Port Fairy and Warrnambool, you go to WA.
I was living in an old stone cottage, and the only heating was a big fireplace, and I was scrunching up newspaper to make a fire. This sounds so improbable. This is actually how it happened. And there's this piece of newspaper with a job ad on it for a native title solicitor. I thought, that sounds interesting. Unscrunched it, rang the number, and I was flown over for an interview. So at the time, my scheming little mind was thinking, I get a free flight to WA here, this will be fun.
But it translated into a job.
It did. So the job was based in a place called Walloona, which is geographically pretty much the exact centre of WA. It's 10 hours to each coast from there. And I was interviewed by a fire on an Aboriginal community. The elders sat for quite a long time, and often with their backs to me. And there was this strange flowing and undulating conversation that went on for a while. We were all on these plastic school chairs. There were kids riding little bikes around. And after some time, somebody must have nodded and they said, right, you got the job. You can start when you want.
And they presented you with an employment contract, which you duly signed?
It was more informally done than that, I would say. And they said, that house over there, we'll get that fixed up for you. That can be your place, which never eventuated.
You knew nothing about native title at the time?
Nothing whatsoever. It was interesting. The year that I did property law was the year that Mabo No. 2 was handed down. So I remember the property lecturer saying, I'm teaching you about feasibility of title and English common law, but there's this incredible thing happening in our High Court and all of this might get turned on its head. So that was the very year that happened, and that was as much as I knew of native title. So the job was that the Land Council was based in Port Hedland up north, and that they had identified a group of people in the Western Desert called the Mardu people, who had a very, very strong and continuing link to the desert country. They were excellent prospects for a native title claim because they were still practising ceremony, their language was strong, they were still initiating young men. All of those things were in place and completely uninterrupted by invasion. And the link was so strong. There was an old Mardu couple who came in from the desert and made first contact in 1977. So arguably the last first contact in Australian history. And it's so recent in history that it's on film. There's a documentary called The Last of the Nomads, which is about that moment. And it's quite an amazing thing to see.
I was interested in something that you said, that a woman who may have been your boss, I'm not sure, her name is Fiona, a lawyer from Perth. She told you it would be hard to get the Indigenous people to embrace you, but if they do, it will change you. Yeah,
or words along the lines of, they may not let you in, but if they do, you won't recover. And it was absolutely right. I remember there was a period of polite standoffishness, and then there was, over time, there was an embrace, and that I felt completely unworthy of that and very conscious of the idea that white fellas fly in and they fly out. And ultimately I became one of those. And I feel like whatever it was I did for them, the benefit absolutely accrued my way. That in my life, it was this tremendous revelation of something profound about being Australian. I don't think I did anywhere near that much for them.
Very interesting indeed. Back on the legal track, Jock, native title work, what did it entail? I mean, you weren't sitting in an office somewhere going through documents.
No, this is 97, so it's the year after WIC, and it's a few years after Mabo, nobody really knew how to do day-to-day native title work very well at that stage. So the nearest thing the Land Council could come up with was they wanted me to go out on country with senior people. Firstly, think about who those senior people were, and then go out on country with them and go to sites and talk about the sites, record the stories, map the sites, photograph them, and bring all of that back and sort of gather it up in affidavit form for what was then the Native Title Tribunal, was the first point of contact for the claim, in order to build a claim. So it was a gathering process, and I would spend weeks out on the desert. We'd go out in a few Toyotas and there would be all these old people, and because I was the white fella, I had the old people in my car. There'd be dozens of kids in all these other cars and young people, and we would be not on tracks, we would be driving across the desert floor, just sort of bouncing along on spinifex, and all of a sudden everybody would start yelling to stop because they'd found something they wanted to talk about. And we did this for weeks in searing heat. It was the most bizarre and wonderful experience. I loved it.
And were you writing down things when they wanted to stop and tell you a story or point something out?
Yes.
You were literally pen and paper writing it out?
Yes. And there was always discussion about whether and in what context that was appropriate. Had to be very careful with that. And the same with photographing things. And I had a little GPS gadget, which at the time was extremely sophisticated. It's probably an antique now, so that you could mark where you were. And most of those were rock holes. There were other formations, but mostly it was little water cavities in the desert floor.
And they had a meaning, they had a significance.
Absolutely.
Which the people could explain to you.
Yes, absolutely.
Language wasn't a problem?
There was probably a process of interpretation going on where the old people would talk in Manjuljara and that would come to me through the younger people. And some of the younger people kind of appointed themselves as interpreters for exactly that job. And all of these things happened in accordance with authority structures, which it took me a long time to understand what was going on around me at any given moment.
Fascinating, Jock, absolutely fascinating. You come back to Melbourne in 98. What brought you back?
Things got very rugged at the Land Council. There was corruption there. The work was done was one thing, in that I had assembled the claim and filed it. So really a long, slow administrative and then judicial process had to take effect from there. So that work was done. Things were also pretty bad in the Land Council and it's since been deregistered.
And so for those reasons, it wasn't tenable to stay there, really?
No. And I think, again, this comes back to the notion of white fellas flying in and flying out. There was a big part of me that just wanted to see green ground again. I'd been out in this orange dirt for so long that I missed my friends, I missed my family, and I was keen to get home by that stage.
When you came back, why did you choose to go to the bar? Had it been something in the back of your mind since university days? You'd really like to be an advocate?
No. I had done that little bit of advocacy in Warrnambool, in the Warrnambool courthouse. I think this starts a long process of trying to make law interesting and more story-driven, which is a thing I can see in hindsight, but I probably couldn't see at the time, that I was looking for stories. And I have a very close friend, Jared Dalton, who had always been hell-bent on going to the bar, and he was ready to go into the September intake that year. And I thought, okay, I'm at a loose end. This could be an interesting way to now turn the career, and I could do more native title as a barrister. So I had an awkward sort of 6 months to kill before the next reader's course. And in those days, there wasn't an exam to get into it. You basically put your name down, and the theory was that market forces would find you out if you were no good. So that was what I did next. And
read with Jeff Chettle, who subsequently became a county court judge?
Yes. In fact, in a room not 20 feet from where we are now.
And what was the experience like of reading with Jeff?
Well, it was wonderful. Jeff is and was a great character and a fabulous advocate. And if there was a difficulty, it was that Jeff's mind goes at such a pace that for an ordinary plotter like me, you're desperately trying to keep up all the time. And then there's Jeff saying, this is easy, don't you understand? This is perfectly simple. And I'd be frantically scrambling to keep up.
And in doing that, in reading with Jeff, in watching and seeing his mind operate and seeing other people operate, did he help you gain some confidence that you could do it?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he inexplicably always had confidence that I would get through it and work it out and do it well. And to this day, we still chat and I still get that vibe from Jeff. He's marvellous. And that was one of the things that I loved about being at the bar, was that there was this culture of mentorship and that people's doors were genuinely open. And that was the first time I'd seen that among lawyers, that it was a collaborative effort, and that although we were all little islands in an archipelago, we were all there to help each other out, and that it was very important that knowledge was passed backwards to junior people.
There hasn't been a version of Jeff Chettle in any of your novels?
There are versions of several lawyers in there, but I think what I try to do is to take traits rather than whole people.
Yeah.
So that sometimes you get these Frankensteinian lawyers who are made of lots of lawyers.
Now, early days at the bar, you get briefed in a very big murder trial, the Silk Miller murders. Maybe if you can remind us what those murders were, what the circumstances were, and then what was your role in it?
Yes, so Silk and Miller were two mid-career detectives who were on a stakeout trying to catch a pair of serial armed robbers, and the stakeout was operating. This was the first night of the stakeout in, I think, August 1998, and everybody was in unmarked cars around Asian restaurants in the southeastern suburbs, and Silk and Miller attempted to intercept a vehicle, and they were both shot and killed. And that shocking event launched this chain of legal and political consequences, which were that the state government were under enormous pressure to, firstly, make arrests, and then secondly, to successfully prosecute people. And huge resources were poured into the task force and then into the prosecution of the thing. And the committal had been going for, I think, a year before I came on board, and I came on board as a second junior. So the lead prosecutor was Jeremy Rapke. Then the senior junior was Peter Kidd, now off the Court of Appeal, and Peter happened to be my next-door neighbour in Douglas Menzies' chambers, and he brought me on. And I knew it would be a long job. I thought my role was going to be some sort of research assistance in the background, because there were large computer databases of stuff that needed to be winnowed down into effective evidence. And as it turned out, from day one of that trial, Jeremy was standing me up and getting me to examine witnesses in the Supreme Court. So it was a huge gesture of trust, and it was a great opportunity to be in that really rarefied atmosphere.
Was it a bit overawing to be taking witnesses in such a high-profile trial?
Absolutely, it was. The two accused were up the back, just standing right behind you, and there were media in the room. There was a jury. It was a jury of 15 because they knew it was a long trial. Justice Cummins was presiding, and the grand old room, the atmosphere of all of that is quite daunting. And I remember that early on in the experience, I completely stuffed up the first few witnesses, and I just thought, okay, this fairy tale ride is now over, and marched back to Jeremy's chambers thinking this is going to be an all-time bollocking. And in fact, he said, right, well, that didn't go very well, did it? And in his quiet voice, and I said, no, that did not go very well. And he said, here's 10 more witnesses, now do them properly. So the immediate response to my stuff up was a vote of confidence, which is a thing I've never forgotten about how to mentor people.
It's a great example of leadership, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So this is early days in your practice, and you've been given a gift, really, of being a junior in a major trial. Did that help your practice develop more quickly? And did it help your confidence as a barrister?
I think yes to both of those things. What happened to my criminal practice was that it then split in two, so that I had more work as a junior in prosecutions in the superior courts, and I had defence work in the lower courts. And I quite liked that combination. Very different sets of skills and obviously different pacing. The Magi's Court goes really fast, and the Supreme Court has that lovely ponderous quality to it where everything can be done in time and carefully.
And did you, even back then, see it as storytelling? Your role as a storyteller?
Yes, I did. And one of the interesting side effects of that is that I was really drawn to doing guilty pleas because it was an opportunity to start with an accepted basis that we are taking what we've done on board, but let's look at how this happened and what can now be done about it. And within the confines of not stretching the truth, that to me was a great creative exercise in storytelling, that you were trying to draw the bench in almost beside you to think together about a solution to a problem rather than it simply being this binary exchange. And I always loved that side of it. I found talking to juries, although it is a form of storytelling, I don't think I reached a level of proficiency where I was doing that at such a great level.
With the guilty pleas, do you think our system, do we do enough with the accused person who has, obviously there are circumstances in their life that's got them to this position? You're trying to say to the court, this is this person's story. This person doesn't need punishment. This person needs help and assistance. Does our system allow for that?
I think there's a punitive element in the media that doesn't, that we're driven towards the notion that some people are inherently criminals. And I think there's a salacious element in true crime podcasting, which is coming at it from another harmful angle, which is that this stuff is endlessly intriguing for voyeurs and that we should enjoy it as storytelling. And I think both of those approaches are misguided. People commit crimes for all sorts of reasons, and we can get down to the reasons if we think long and hard about them, both in an individual sense and in a collective societal sense. We can reduce crime by being more systematic about the way we treat each other, and that's a whole different thing from what's on the front of the Herald Sun.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
At the same time as you've developed this criminal practice or developing this criminal practice, you're also doing asylum seeker work pro bono?
Yes, I was. That started with a couple of task forces. Back then, asylum seekers were being processed onshore, so in places like Derby and Baxter and Maribyrnong and Silverwater, and they would form these task forces of volunteers where you'd go in, a boat had come in, so there were a couple of hundred people that needed to be processed, and you would go inside the detention centre and sit down in interview rooms with the asylum seeker individually and with an interpreter, and you would help them to make their claim for asylum. And that then later on evolved into doing federal court appeals, which is the way things were structured at the time, that they went to a single judge, then a full court of the federal court. I think that might have all changed now. But again, coming back to the story idea of practising law, there could not be a more foreign exchange between two human beings than being a privileged lawyer from Melbourne and sitting with an Afghan who has fled through Pakistan and out into Indonesia and across the sea to get to here. The stories took on a similar quality because people were having similar experiences, and that was often used against people later on in the proceedings, that the suggestion that there'd been collaboration between applicants. But I loved the experience of working with the interpreters. They were great people. Often they were from a previous wave of Afghan asylum seekers who had fled the Soviets. So they were different people ethnically, and they were often very educated. And the wave of asylum seekers that we were dealing with were mostly Hazaras who were subsistence farmers. And that difference was quite acute, but they were so ethical and objective about the way they did their interpreting work, but also so very invested in that system.
Did our system enable the judicial officers to listen to individual stories and to become engaged in a story like as you were engaged in the story as their representative?
No, I think is the short answer. One of the things I discovered when I made that move into doing the appellate work was that I was coming at it with an approach that was useful in criminal guilty pleas, which was I want to generate empathy in this room by explaining where all this has come from and how painful it was and how dangerous the situation was. But the Migration Act at the time, I think, was Australia's second most amended act after the Income Tax Act. It was a huge piece of legislation that was being frantically reinvented all the time by federal governments to keep up with the various political approaches they wanted to take. And that meant that the only useful approach in a federal court appeal was a highly technical one which managed to keep up with that ever-changing act. And here's me with my little violin trying to do that routine. It didn't work as often as I would have liked.
So let's get back to your legal journey, Jock, where you're heading to, and you head back to Port Fairy. Now, We should give it some context, I think. This is really about family life, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That move was made because of family, how you wanted your family to grow up.
Yeah, and at this stage, nothing at all to do with any thought of going back to writing, which in retrospect is kind of weird. But no, my wife Lil and I, we by then had one toddler and a second pregnancy on the way, and we kind of unusually had this very grown-up discussion where we asked ourselves where all this was going. And Lil at the time was practising as a nurse at St Vincent's, and I was doing what I was doing at the bar, and we had a kid and a pregnancy, as I say. And once we looked at things, we thought we wanted to have a big family, and we couldn't imagine ourselves sustaining a big family doing what we were doing. That there are people who are born to that sort of pressure, and all power to them. I think that's an incredible gift, but I'm probably not one of them. And we decided that if we moved to the country, we could have the big family, we could afford the education, and we could work at the pace we wanted to work at rather than being chained to some kind of torture device. And so once we thought of it in those terms, then I suppose the next thought was, well, where would we go? We both wanted to go to the coast. I had some previous connection with Port Fairy and some friends there, so it seemed the logical place to go. So off we went.
And where did you find work?
Back at the firm I'd been at 8 years previously. So I went back in sort of with an understanding about a partnership. I was still doing some criminal advocacy work in the local courts, but I was mostly doing personal injury work, and then that evolved into commercial litigation. I had a crack at family law, and I think towards the end I was doing estates.
You say towards the end, you had, on my counting, maybe 9 or 10 years of working with Maddens in Warrnambool, taking on a partnership and doing that work. During that time, maybe for the first time, I say for the first time, from childhood you'd wanted to be a writer. But it's during that period that you get your first opportunity to do some creative writing.
Yeah, so what's going on in the background, I think as we had more kids and there were more of those crazy nights that everybody knows where you're sort of up and down and you're awake and you're half awake and you're wandering around the house in a daze, and I thought to myself, I could do some writing during these down times. And I started off, I was surfing with a guy from a couple of streets away who was publishing a surfing magazine. So I started off doing a couple of pieces for him, and I really enjoyed them. And then that led to writing for a bigger national surfing magazine. And this was probably towards the tail end of the life of these magazines. Now they're mostly defunct. Surfing's a very visual culture. People aren't that interested in people writing about it anymore. The photography is amazing these days, so it's mostly an Instagram culture. But at that stage, there were still big magazines that were viable. So I did a few trips with the magazines and wrote things up. I had an interest, I guess, with the surfing magazines in thinking about the surfing in bigger human terms. So I wrote things about First Nations surfing, about mental health, about coral biology, anything I could think of that was opening up the field of what surfing was. And I had a couple of editors who, to their great credit, were willing to tolerate that sort of nonsense and really enjoyed the work. And ever so gradually that evolved into trying little pieces of fiction with a local writing group. There's lots of these little groups in the suburbs and in country towns where you sit down on a Sunday afternoon and there's a packet of Tim Tams and a bad Shiraz and everybody reads out some little thing that they've written. I think after a couple of years of doing that, I looked at all of the little pieces of fiction that I'd written and some of the non-fiction that I'd written, and I thought about the ways in which I was really writing about the same stuff, and that if I tweaked various details of that fiction, you could kind of stick it all on a wall and it was a novel, that you could get this whole arc through it, that would have been around maybe 2010 was the first time I started thinking I could tip out a novel.
When we read about authors, we often read about them having notebooks in which they jot down pieces of dialogue and possibly ideas for a plot and thoughts in general. Had you kept a notebook over the years where you'd written things down that you might see later on developing into something?
I always wrote diaries when I was away. So I wrote a diary throughout being in the Western Desert. I wrote a diary years earlier when I'd been in South America. Every time I did a road trip, I'd write a diary. But I'm not somebody who has ever felt the need to record what happened today. That feels a little bit too self-referential to me. I like to write about other places that I'm looking at or other people who I've encountered. And I do go back to those diaries from time to time, but it's amazing how quickly you are surprised and a little disappointed by the person you find in your own diary. So I don't do it too much.
So you didn't have a notebook full of jottings over the years?
No, just those specific recollections of trips, I think.
So writing starting to come along, you piecing together bits that you've written over years, you're thinking, oh, this could be a novel here. I could make something out of this. Were you having difficulty juggling that with legal practice?
Yeah, I think of it now as a three-cornered struggle that by now we had 4 small kids and the partnership had its demands and the writing was building up. I was being asked to go away and write things up more.
This was by the surfing magazine?
Yeah, mostly, yeah. And once I knew that I had a novel, I was pitching the novel. When that was ultimately picked up by a publisher, there was a lot of pressure to keep working on that manuscript and get it better and better. So I was using all of my nights, I was using my weekends, I was using my annual leave to churn out this writing. And I was so, I guess, enamoured by what was happening and how much I was enjoying it that I very quickly got to a point where I wasn't keeping up with all 3 things. And that was when I came to a bit of a crutch point.
Had you ever done a creative writing course?
No, and I look around now and I see so much support for beginner writers that there are courses, there's a lot of material online, there are fellowships, there are these hot desk programs. There are lots and lots of ways to find your way in, and either those weren't available at the time or I simply wasn't aware of them. So I was just banging away in spare rooms and pitching manuscripts to all sorts of obscure people to see what would happen.
What intrigues me about that, and I may be off the point here, I can understand the writing bit, but as someone with no background in writing, a lawyer, how do you get the structure of a novel right?
I think
legal drafting is a lot about structure.
Yes.
Got to get the structure right to legally draft. I'm assuming novels are the same.
Yes, I think there is a shared instinct which is to be concise, to get rid of verbiage, but I really didn't know. I read a lot of novels and I love lots of different novels in different ways. When I tried to make that first novel, I had this notion about it that, having experienced a lot of criminal trials, I was always fascinated by the fact that the delivery system for the story is so completely unnatural that you present a decision maker, whether it's a judge or a jury, you're presenting them with snippets of audio and bits of CCTV and witness statements and viva voce testimony and DNA results and all sorts of things. And you just throw them all at the decision maker. And then at the end, there's this binary yes or no, which is not the way we tell each other narratives about what happened. And that idea intrigued me. So I tried to write a crime novel that was a collection of these fragments that would ever so gradually wind their way towards some stunning conclusion, and it was a mess.
Now, was this your first novel, Quota?
Yes, and I pitched that to all sorts of people who quite rightly said no, and then one person, Mandy Brett at Text Publishing, said, look, the answer's no, but if you ever want to have a coffee and have a talk about your writing, we can do that. So I'm on the phone in 30 seconds flat saying, right, when are we having the coffee? And what Mandy's considered conclusion was, look, your novel's shit, but you can clearly write, so why don't we talk about totally redoing this thing in a way that is understandable and coherent, and then we'll have another look at publishing it. So that process went on for maybe 2 years, I think, of Mandy and I having coffees and Mandy saying, no, needs another run through.
How was that for your ego, being told it's incoherent and rubbish?
Well, I remember saying to her, halfway through a sandwich, do I throw it in the bin and write something else, or can it be saved? And there was this awful long silence, and then she said, look, you might be able to save it. That was bad for my ego.
But I mean, all right, so your first novel gets published, but in fact, it took 2 years and 2 complete rewrites.
Yeah, in fact, it took a lot longer than that because writing it in its own right was a long process. And then there were 2 years of rewrites. So I guess top to bottom, it would have been 5 or 6 years writing that novel.
Yeah. Just to go off point a bit, and what remuneration do you get for 5 years of work as a novelist?
The advance on that novel was $3,500, and it was on the basis of that advance that I went to Lil and said, look, I think I can throw my legal career in. I think we're good to go. And I reckon the first mortgage payment might have eaten that up. Didn't last long.
No, it's no one ever says that novelists, particularly in a market like Australia, make an exorbitant living.
No, and like a lot of fields, I think the handful of standout successes can warp people's understanding of how lucrative the career is. There are a handful of Australian authors, and good luck to them, who have had debuts that have smashed it out of the park, and they're very visible, and as a result it looks to people like it's an easy road to money, and it's definitely not.
So we've got to this stage in your career. You're still a partner of Madden's in Warrnambool. How did you extricate yourself from the practice?
That was an awkward, painful chapter. It didn't go well getting out, and I found myself out in the cold much sooner than I had expected to be. And there were a few consequences to that. One was I hadn't really planned out what was going to be the everyday wage earning while I was waiting for novels to do their thing, because novels are a very slow payment cycle. Yeah, it was a big adjustment, and I did lots and lots of funny side hustles, like helping out at a surf school and other things along the way. And I had to very quickly increase the amount of non-fiction I was writing in order to help out with cash flow. So that's probably what saved the day.
And yet you didn't renew your practising certificate.
No,
You could have done locums and earned money that way.
This is right. I hadn't thought about this for a single minute. I happened to have finished up on the 30th of June, and I think on the 2nd or 3rd of July I had a call from the Law Institute, and someone in there said that, you know, there must have been some red light that goes off somewhere in their office that says Serong hasn't renewed his practising certificate. And he said, what do you intend to do? And I hadn't thought about it. And I said, well, what are my options? And he said, a lot of people like you. And I said, what are people like me? And he said, oh, you know, people go off to do impro theatre or whatever. People like you tend to keep their practising certificates so that when it all falls in a heap, they can come back. And something about that tone of voice made me say, throw the damn thing in the bin, because if I keep the practising certificate, I will go back. If I've got a safety net, I'll use it. And indeed, over that subsequent couple of years, there were innumerable times when I thought, oh, if only I had the practising certificate, would have saved us. So I'm glad it went that way. But again, it was a bit accidental at the time, I think.
Jock, what impact, if any, has 20-odd years in the law had upon your writing? Are there habits and lessons you learned as a practising lawyer which have translated across to being an author? Is there anything else from your time as a lawyer which has stood you in good stead to be a writer?
Well, it's interesting. There are people publishing novels in Australia today who are still maintaining professional careers while they're doing it, particularly doctors for some reason. And I'm always interested in what leaks across from that career into the writing career. I think for me, there's been two unrelated things. One is that if you spend enough years selling your time as the product, then you become very, very conscious of your own productivity, and the notion of sitting in a cafe staring at the wall, enjoying the coffee until the angels start singing is simply not available to you, that you need to make all of the time productive in some way or other. So you lower your expectations about these moments of great creative inspiration, and you think about, okay, what's the hard stuff I can do? I think that's a lawyer's instinct. The other unrelated idea is that although you can't use the individual stories you've been exposed to in legal practice, what you can use is the way people are under that sort of pressure, that you're watching people process the worst experience of their lives. And that means you're watching their eyes, you're watching their hands, you're watching the way they position their body, you're listening to the way their voice works, and all of those things somehow feed their way into character when you come to write fiction. I think one of the great privileges of working in a profession like law is the intimate proximity you have to huge moments in people's lives. And that's a really sacred thing to have shared with somebody as part of your work. That somehow finds its way across, I think.
You say sacred moments in people's lives. I believe there's a scene in your latest novel, Cherrywood, which came from a professional experience, Was that a sacred moment? Maybe you could tell us about it.
This may be a reference to a team bonding weekend I was taken on by a large commercial firm who had better remain nameless for these purposes. But the litigation team were going to go off to, I think it was Werribee Mansion, I can't remember now. But there was this awful, awful night in a restaurant that had been booked out for us, and all of the drinks were on the firm and people got awfully drunk, and all of the young colts wound up in the room of the litigation head. And the litigation head stood there, I think, next to his wardrobe, holding forth about ruthlessness and about taking every point and about how we were winners and about how we would assert ourselves and that we needed to dominate and that compromise was, if I catch any of you compromising, all of this nonsense. And I worked this into my last novel, Cherrywood, and Martha, my hero in that book, gets up and walks out. She's had enough of this palaver. When it happened to me in real life, I sat there and just took it on, just absorbed it for hours. It went on. And all of these starry-eyed young colts going, God, this guy's amazing. He's really got this worked out, this caper.
You're teaching writing now as well, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. So
at one of the universities?
I teach in a variety of capacities. So there are organisations like Writers Victoria and Kill Your Darlings who offer courses in writing fiction. I've done online courses for them. I've done Zooms and rooms, and sometimes local writing clubs. I did one on the weekend where you go and turn up and go through a slideshow and talk about technique. So there's that side of it. I have done a couple in prisons, and at the absolute other end of the spectrum, I work with judicial colleges on courses for judges about their legal writing, which is a part of the work I really enjoy.
So you're telling judges how to write their judgments or write them better. In the past, you may have been appearing before those judges and quaking in your boots.
Exactly. And I don't think I'm telling them how to write. I think I'm part of a faculty of people who are gently sitting beside them and making suggestions. And yes, I am still in the process of sort of de-terrorising myself that, yeah, you as an advocate, I suppose you have a certain relationship to judicial officers, which is proper, but to then sit down with them and talk to them about their work and see their private work ethic is a really interesting difference. I'm so struck by A, how clever these people are, but B, how hard they're prepared to work and how the self-volition of that there's nobody hovering over your shoulder, I imagine, in those roles. It's up to you to get to the standard that you want to be at. And that comes through in the courses.
You say there's nobody hovering over your shoulder, but are judges sometimes writing, thinking about how will this look if the Court of Appeal get hold of it?
Yes, they are. And as a novelist, I'm sometimes tempted to write in a way that defends me against criticism I can see coming. And I've learned over time that writing defensively is the worst thing you can do. And the same thing seems to apply with these courses, that presidents of courts of appeal will come and address the course and they'll say to the judges, don't write as though you're worried about us, that appeal is an ordinary part of the process and a necessary part of the process. It's not personal. You will get tipped over at some point. Don't let it affect your writing in such a way that you hide your conclusions behind mountains of equivocation because you're worried about us. And that exact lesson applies analogously to what I do.
Interesting, isn't it, how they it keeps coming back. Both they cross over each other, both the law and your life as an author.
They do, and both of them go way, way back. You know, they go back to Samuel Johnson and beyond him, I imagine. It's deep.
Back to your life as an author. We've mentioned Quota, your first novel. From then, your next novel was one that I consider has possibly the best title of any novel I've read, called The Rules of Backyard Cricket. And it goes on trilogy to do with Aboriginal people, Tasmania, Victoria, convicts, preservation. Help me here, Jock.
The Burning Island.
The Burning Island.
The Settlement, yeah.
The Settlement. The two of mine, you had the definite article and one of them didn't. And Cherrywood now is your last, and I've missed one or two in there as well, haven't I?
On the Java Ridge.
That's right, on the Java Ridge, which is surfing and
asylum seekers.
Asylum seekers up in Indonesia, yeah. Can you make a reasonable living? I mean, because they've been successful.
Yep.
And people that want to write and haven't written yet, they'd look at you and consider there's a person who's very successful as an Australian author.
Well, I think the smoke and mirrors are very important here. You need to give that impression. There is a tolerable living to be had selling novels within Australia. But really, to make any significant headway, either you want to have your work adapted for screen or for stage, and or you want to sell overseas. And those two projects are ongoing. There's small positive movements in those directions over time, but it's a long, slow hustle, I'm afraid.
And as an author and someone who's driven and motivated by the desire to tell a story, but you've also got a bit of a commercial link in your brain thinking it'd be good if we could make this into a movie. If someone made it into a movie, it'd be good if we could get rights and sell it overseas. So that goes on in your thinking as well.
Well, only because you want the thing that you love doing to be sustainable. So in order to go back to the publisher and say, I've got another idea, you want to have some proof of concept of the last idea. And that applies in lots and lots of creative arts, that if I can drive a peg into this tree and stand on it, I can do it again and do it again. And yeah, the mere sustainability of the thing, so that I know I can comfortably go back to the room I work in and bury myself in a new idea and be somewhat self-sustaining, that's the sweet spot.
So you say bury yourself in a new idea. Where do ideas come from? I mean, watching the news of a night on TV, or conversations with friends, or...
I think all of us, I imagine, conceive of the same range and number of ideas about life all of the time, but all that you're doing as a writer is training yourself to be receptive to them and to collect them. So I keep files of interesting things that have crossed my radar during the day all of the time. There's one that's a physical file of paper, and there's files in the computer. And I try to ask myself, if the thing I've just encountered, the interesting thing I overheard, or the thing I saw in the news, or a lyric I plucked out of a song, or whatever that might be, if I can think of a way of connecting that to the last one I put in there, some of them start to grow into these clumps of ideas. And once there's a certain clumpiness, I don't know how you identify it, but once you get to a clumpy point, this is now a potential story, and out it comes from that file, and I start thinking of it as a story. And really, there's a point, once you start writing your way through that clump of ideas, there's this point where the momentum, you're no longer pushing the rock is actually rolling away from you. And once you get to that point, you know you're on, because you might write a bad novel, but you're going to finish this novel. And once it's finished, you can chip away at it and chip away at it until it's a good novel. So once you hit that point of forward momentum and you know you're on, that's an enormously reassuring feeling.
And what about as we sit here today? Have you got something on the go? Is the rock starting to roll, either you pushing it or it rolling away from you?
This rock thoroughly got away from me. I'm doing a biography of a man called Fletcher Jones.
Warrnambool?
Yes. It's a Warrnambool story originally. He is an utterly fascinating man who survived Fromelles in World War I, the worst night in Australia's military history. He went on to create this really very large empire making and selling clothes, but which was almost entirely owned by his workers. He was a socialist, and he'd become quite fixated with a Japanese philosopher called Kagawa, and Kagawa's way was that the workers owned the enterprise. So Fletcher Jones handed over the vast bulk of his operation to his workers, and was universally loved. And I wanted to, yes, it's literally an exercise in biography, but I wanted to think about whether that is a product of its time and is extinct, that sort of corporate thinking, whether the possibility remains to go back to it in the age of fast fashion.
I doubt it, but I hope I'm wrong.
Yes.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
So where are we now in this long and interesting career you've had so far, Jock? But you've still got plenty of time to go. Looking back from when you were admitted back, in the mid-90s to now, are you happy with this path you followed? And even more important, is Lil happy?
I think Lil's happy. I'm around more, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. But I think there's a funny stigma that attaches to the term former lawyer, that it's very hard to say it without sounding like something went dreadfully wrong. And I loved my time as a lawyer. I made friendships that endure to this day, and I learned all sorts of important things. I'm really glad I went through it, and I can't imagine being a writer in middle age and having done that straight out of high school, for instance, or straight out of uni even. Firstly, because I don't think enough of life had happened to me by then. And secondly, because it's an easier financial basis to launch into a writing career, having had some other career. It would be a very difficult thing to own a house as a writer, is the ugly reality.
And the advice your parents gave you all those years ago, which apparently you resented, which was if you get a law degree, you can be a lawyer and then subsequently write. But if you start with writing, it'd be hard to go back and be a lawyer. Yes. Maybe that was good advice by your parents?
I will reluctantly give them that one.
Jock, it's been wonderful to talk to you here this morning. I think a lot of us would like to take the journey that you've taken without the risks that you've taken, though. To follow a dream, to follow your creative instincts and have the courage to do it and the courage to follow it through is something really special, I think. So well done and congratulations.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.